All right. Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar on supervised visitation. I'm going to let our speaker introduce herself and her topic here in just a few minutes. But if you have difficulties hearing the presenter, or you can always use our chat feature, and I'll go over some housekeeping items here in just a second. So, just a couple housekeeping items. If you need to ask a question during the presentation, use the chat feature, which is found on the right side of your screen. And to earn 1 CEU, you will need to obtain the code that is at the end of this webinar. So make sure you stay on until the very end so you can get that code if you want to get a CEU. And just as a reminder, we are recording this webinar, and we will upload this presentation to our webpage in the next week or so. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our speaker, Dawn Duray, and let her introduce herself and her topic.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I apologize if my voice goes in and out. I've had laryngitis this week, and so I'm hoping my voice hangs in there for our presentation. I'm going to be talking today about supervised visitations and monitored custodial exchanges. I recently expanded my private practice to include this service, and so I wanted to give you guys some background information about what supervised visitations are, as well as to understand the needs for the supervised visitations and how to refer to the agency. I've been in private practice since 2007 after working at UAMS in the Child Study Center and Department of Psychiatry. And so I look forward to presenting this information and answering any questions you all have during the presentation. So we will go to the objectives page. And again, like I said, we're just going to talk about the different supervised visitations and what that is. I know our last presentation last month was from the child welfare section of talking about how court is involved in those services. This is mainly in the domestic relations side of things, as well as child welfare. And so you'll see some overlap and some discussion about the need for some of these services. And again, also what information that we would need from the court and or the referral person to continue with these services. All right. So just basically wanted to go over kind of the reason why we wanted to offer these services, and just a quick statistics on families, but really looking at that last one, which is Arkansas has the second highest divorce rate in the country. And this is based on CDC 2011 statistics. And so the divorce rate, I think, is at 5.3% in the state of Arkansas. And so if we look at kind of the risk factors for divorce, we look at serious illness or death of an infant or of a child. But a lot of it really has to do with that time, money, and work. And if we look at lower SES, as well as families that have substance abuse and alcoholism or an untreated depressive illness. And so a lot of times if you have the substance abuse, the alcoholism, a major mental health issue, a lot of times when the divorce occurs, one parent is left without being able to see a child. And so that's part of the reason why we offer these supervised visitations. And what are the effects then on children? And so really it depends on the age at which the divorce occurred. And so even looking at the events during the divorce or separation and after the divorce can be particularly hard on children. And so for couples, it's really important for them to understand that children are most vulnerable during the ongoing divorce, as well as the after effects of the divorce. If we look at preschool children, a lot of them have those fears of abandonment and they regress to earlier behaviors. You might see depression during the latency age, and they have a lot of fantasies about their parents reunifying and getting back together. And then when we look at kind of the pre-adolescent, early adolescent, a lot of times we'll see that anger that they have towards one or both parents, and also being kind of placed in the middle and having to split their loyalties between their parents. And then for adolescents, we see that anxiety about becoming an adult. And so if we look at the outcomes for children of divorce, we really see a better outcome when a child has a continued relationship with both parents. And this is from parents that are willing and able and effective parents. And so if you have a parent that has no interest in having contact with their child, that's a completely different concern, and that certainly is the poor outcome. But if we can have two parents that want that relationship and are effective in that relationship, it certainly is a better outcome for children to continue the relationship with both parents. And then, of course, the genuine concern by both parents. Again, that's being actively involved in their children's lives. And then there's also a good outcome, certainly if you're removing from an abusive parent, which most of us in the trauma-focused CBT have that as part of some of the work that we do. And so that definitely is a good outcome for a child that's involved in that is being abused by a parent, and then the divorce helps them separate from that parent. And then the divorce also, for a good outcome, is when we have that dissipation of the parental friction. And I really highlighted the two that, as we go forward with understanding supervised visitation, is the reason that that good outcome is important. And then if we look at the poor outcome, about a third of children do have a poor outcome after the divorce. When there's infrequent or unreliable visits by the non-custodial parent, and this again plays into the reason for having supervised visits. If there's continued parental strife, then it's a poor outcome for the children, and therefore having monitored custodial exchanges is a way to help limit some of that parental strife, and we'll get into that. But I just wanted you to see the outcomes and understand the background for doing the services of supervised visitations and monitored custodial exchanges. So what we're really talking about is the family services, and this is during or after a divorce or separation where a child may be adversely affected. And what we want in these services is for the child to be able to have a safe and healthy interactive environment for their contact with their parents, and really have a neutral and a place that they can have fun with a non-residential parent. And let me talk a little bit about what we mean by residential versus non-residential parent. A lot of times you'll see the term non-custodial, or you'll see primary physical custodian, and you'll see the visitation or the visiting parent. And I really like to use the term non-residential and residential parent to really help understand that a parent is still a parent. They're not visiting. And so that's why we use the term non-residential, and that might also mean residential for the primary physical custodian. The last thing is we also have these services so that the parents are safe, and so they too want to reduce that conflict or tension so it's not present for their children. So that's the reason that the family services are offered. What we see, too, in supervised visitations is that it's based on the idea that the parent-child relationship is of benefit to the child, regardless of how limited that might be. And again, if we go back to those positive and negative outcome slide, you can understand that visitation then allows that child to have contact with both parents. And as a caveat in the beginning, I said it has to be a parent that's willing and able and is able to function as a parent for that child. And what the main concern then of the supervised visitation is really the emotional and physical welfare of the child. And we really want the visit to benefit the child and not expose the child to harm or danger. And so if there continues to be, this is why in a child that might be involved in a trauma-focused CBT therapy and they've gone through the protocol and are having a really good outcome from that, then as a way to reunify that relationship with one parent is to make sure then that they're not exposed to that harm or danger, and that might be a reason why the referring agency is still working with the child and can work with our agency to say, hey, this child is reacting this way, and then that helps us understand how the visit is, if it's being helpful or not helpful to the child. So when we look at supervised visitations, there really are kind of two different major categories of those. One category is what we call supportive supervised visitations. And this is, again, an intervention to maintain the child's safety and to maintain that relationship with family members. And it really focuses on appropriate parent-child interactions. And then I'll go into more detail in just a minute. Then there's also therapeutic supervised visitation, and this is really more of a therapeutic intervention to provide that support for the parent-child relationship and really to work on what are some of those positive behavioral changes that can happen in a parent-child relationship. And just so you know that at any time, any contact between the visiting party or the non-residential parent and the child is under supervision at all times. And so what that means is that the supervisor or family specialist is in that session at all times. At no time is a parent and a child left without there being supervision or monitoring of their interactions. And really we expect our parties to interact with the children in a positive and supportive manner, and that's why the supervisor is there to make sure that that's what's occurring. We want really that communication or behavior to be emotionally and physically supportive of the child, not threatening to the child. And then also another thing in the supportive or the therapeutic visitation, especially in the supportive, we're not going to be discussing litigation or the current legal situations. And then we also want to interrupt anything such as when this is all over or when you get to live with me. And so it's a way, again, to guide those visitations for the benefit of the child. So when we look at a supportive supervised visitation, we are looking at a protected and monitored visitation between the child and the non-residential parent. Again, we really are focused on the child benefiting as much as possible from the contact. We want to assist those families in maintaining that relationship if it's healthy and safe for the child. And so again, the really emphasis is making sure that that child remains safe and that it's a healthy relationship for them. The supportive supervised visitation is facilitated by staff with specialized training to oversee the parent-child contact. There is usually the only intervention that the staff would do in a supportive supervised visitation would be as if there is things being stated to the child about court matters or about adult matters. If the focus is not on the child and having a fun and interactive session, then that's when the staff would interrupt and make sure it's healthy and safe. The staff isn't there to facilitate the communication between the parent and child. They're there to really monitor and make sure that none of those things are occurring that might be not beneficial to the child, which you'll see is very different in a therapeutic visitation. In any supportive supervised visitation, there is going to be neutral and factual documentation of each scheduled visit, just who arrived when, if some type of meal was brought in, if there were some type of gift exchanged. And so really it's just a factual, it's nothing, no opinions are made about, oh, the parent seems to be interacting better with the child. That's not what the goal of the supportive supervised visitation nor the documentation of it. It's really just to make sure that they are following what the court has ordered. All right. So if we look at a therapeutic supervised visitation, we are looking at a therapeutic intervention between the children and the non-residential parent, again, so that the child benefits as much as possible from the contact. In a therapeutic supervised visitation, if you think of a family therapy session, it's much more like a family therapy session, except with the goal of really looking at that visitation as an important contact between the parent and child. We want to assist in a therapeutic supervised visitation. We're assisting children and families in maintaining or reestablishing a relationship to make sure it's healthy and safe for the child. Therefore, it may be that the therapeutic supervisor is going to be intervening in that contact and is going to be working on interventions to help really uphold that parent-child relationship and make that parent-child relationship better. the goal of a therapeutic supervised visitation may also be able to assist that child in the transition to a different family structure. So let's say their non-residential parent may become remarried, and there may be other children in that. And so it may be a way to help transition into a different or blended family to make sure that child is aware of what's going on in the new structure. And again, this is really to help also provide treatment professionals with supplemental information for treatment planning. So if you all are working with a child in individual work or through TFCBT, then you can get feedback from our agency about how they're doing in that therapeutic visitation and give you some information to help in that treatment of that child during that, and give us information about how they're doing in their therapy, and if there are things that we need to be on the lookout for during that supervised visitation. And really this is actively engaging the non-residential parent and child because we want to re-engage that relationship, especially if it's been interrupted by court process or other reasons. And so it could be that it's interrupted by the parent's own behavior rather than maybe behavior toward the child, but behavior within the relationship, or their own mental health or substance abuse issues that have interrupted their ability to be involved in that child's life, and they're receiving the services they need to be able to re-engage in that relationship. So you might be asking yourself, so when would a therapeutic supervised visitation be recommended versus a supportive supervised visitation? And so certainly we recommend a therapeutic supervised visitation when one parent has a history of unhealthy behaviors toward the other parent and or the child. And so if we think of unhealthy behaviors, this might be due to domestic violence, it might be due to substance abuse or alcoholism issues of the one parent, it might be due to some unrelated behavior within the home but outside the home that impacts the relationship within the home. And certainly when we talk about unhealthy behaviors, it can be towards the child too. We also recommend therapeutic supervised visitations when the parent and child have had no prior relationship or when there's been a prolonged lapse in contact. And I've worked with families in the court system who maybe a child came out of wedlock and the biological father was not made aware of having a child until much later into that child's life, and now that biological father would like to be a part of that child's life, and therefore how do we build on a relationship when that child has no idea who this person is? Or it may be a family that is in the middle of a divorce when that child is born and there is a lack of contact between the child, and usually it's the biological father, but I have seen it with the biological mother too, and one of those parents doesn't have the background or the history of knowing how to caretake an infant, and so it may be a therapeutic or supportive visitation to help in that parent being able to interact with that infant in a safe way and have those hands-on people there to help that person through that understanding of how to interact with an infant or a toddler. I've also seen it where there's been a unsubstantiated cases of maltreatment towards the child or false allegations toward one parent toward the child, and therefore there's been a really prolonged lapse of contact, or one parent has taken the child to another state, and so therefore the parent, the non-residential parent has not been able to have that contact with the child, and therefore to introduce that parent back to that child, really to work on those reunification services through a therapeutic visitation would be recommended. I touched on the parent needing help with parenting skills, again, really to help them promote that healthy parent-child interaction. In addition, it may be that we have through the court system, they may have been being supervised by a family member or a family friend, and that really has failed to provide the protection or safety to the child, and there's still conflict or tension that the child is exposed to. And so during like a supervised visitation by a family member or a friend, it may not have allowed that visitation to proceed at the best way possible for the child to benefit from that contact. So that's when a therapeutic supervised visitation may be recommended. We also see cases of in the supportive visitation where that we see that the family support specialist is having to intervene a lot more than you would expect in a supportive visitation, and that might be a case, not necessarily that it's failed, it's just that there needs to be a more trained professional to be able to intervene and provide some therapeutic interventions to help with that parent and child. And really when we talk about this last bullet point is that if there's been a major violation of the child's trust in the non-residential parent, and so I kind of touched on these a little bit earlier, but there's been an abduction of the child, there's been negative gatekeeping or alienation of the child. Again, that could be either the residential parent has engaged in alienating behaviors away from the non-residential parent, or it could be the non-residential parent has engaged in those alienating behaviors. For our sake, this next point, if there's been reasonable, credible maltreatment allegations, then really if we are looking to reunify that relationship, we would want to make sure that there is some therapeutic interventions at play to help reunify that relationship. And I've talked about some of the psychological disturbance of the parent, like a major mental health illness or substance abuse and domestic violence, which is what we usually see a lot in the domestic relations side of court matters versus the child welfare side of court. I want to touch briefly a little bit about what I mean by alienation. I know maybe some of you have heard some of the controversy on is there such a thing as parent alienation syndrome, and I really like to educate others about there is no such DSM, parent alienation syndrome. But in the court system, that has become a really hot topic for them, and a lot of parents will grab onto this notion that I'm being alienated against by the other parent, and that's why I don't have contact with my child. I prefer to use the term negative gatekeeping. So one parent may have valid reasons for wanting contact between the child and the parent to be monitored or to be limited because of behaviors such as domestic violence or psychological disturbance of one of the parents. And so it might not necessarily mean that that parent has been engaging in maltreatment behaviors, but that there is some concerning behaviors of the one parent that prompts the other parent to want to be protective and make sure their child is safe. I certainly have seen cases, though, where the negative gatekeeping behavior really is about the parent not believing the other parent can be a good parent to the child and wanting to keep that child away from that parent without giving that parent the ability to be the parent they want to be. And so it can go on both sides. So one parent could actually have behaviors that alienate their child from them because of their own behaviors, or it could be that one parent it does engage in negative gatekeeping for their own reasons, not because of some behavior of the other parent. However, it does sometimes that child gets placed in the middle, and therefore having a therapeutic supervised visitation helps that child not feel like they're in the middle and helps them be able to start to have whatever relationship they would like to with the other parent. I just want to make sure there weren't any questions before I go on. All right. Now, the difference between a supportive supervised visitation and a therapeutic visitation is about who facilitates those. So a therapeutic supervised visitation is facilitated by a trained licensed clinician. And so they do have to have a license, whether it's a psychologist, a clinical social worker, an LMFT, a professional counselor, or it could be an intern working under the direct supervision of a licensed clinician. And therefore, because it is a therapeutic provider, and so they have to be a licensed mental health professional, and they are paid for providing that supervised visitation service. As we move forward, we're hoping that because it is a therapeutic session, to be able to, on some of it, be able to bill under a family therapy. We're just not there yet, but that's the hope for is to be able to bill as a family therapy session because they are providing therapeutic interventions. So let's talk a little bit about what happens in a therapeutic visitation. And so unlike a supportive visitation, which I mentioned that really the family support specialist is there just to monitor the visit and to intervene only when necessary, a therapeutic visitation, the clinician definitely is using their clinical judgment to determine what the appropriate communication is and also to provide therapeutic interventions. A supportive supervised visitation, there is restrictions on communication. So you're not supposed to talk about past allegations. You're not supposed to talk about court matters or adult matters. You're not supposed to talk about the future and what's going to happen in the future. Really, a supportive visitation is focusing on the present and about the child. And so what the child is doing at school, how the child's, what the child's activities are, playing games, maybe watching a movie together, being involved in maybe having a meal together. And so that's really a supportive visit, whereas the therapeutic, you're going to actively be engaging the child and parent in discussion of the allegations or betrayal of the child's trust. Whatever the primary reason for the referral is, you are going to be discussing that within a therapeutic visitation. There is going to be discussion about issues of adult responsibility, so the adult in that session taking responsibility for their actions, as well as possibly the child feeling like they were pressured or threatened not to tell or to keep secrets. And so it's a way for the child to engage in the progress they've made in their own work to be able to address their concerns, to be able to move forward in that relationship. And this is especially helpful if the child has received trauma-focused CBT, because then they are able to move forward in that relationship, and it offers another layer of protection for the child so that they know that there is a therapeutic clinician there to help them through that, so they're not having to do that by themselves. In the therapeutic visitation, it really gives a chance to really define the difficult relationship between the parent and child. So it's not like acting like, oh, nothing's happened. It's being able to really discuss what happened, what the concerns were both in the past, the present, and the future, so that the child and the parent can move forward in their relationship. And then if as you do in TFCBT, there is a discussion, and you can discuss about the child's emotional, physical, and sexual boundaries when appropriate, as well as safety planning. And so within the therapeutic visitation, you can discuss that safety planning and ways for that child to feel more comfortable and safe with that parent. And I think really with a therapeutic visitation, if you think of it much like a family therapy session, then you are setting that stage for open communication and learning those positive communication skills to talk with the parent and child. And then any helpful dialogue between the parties is really how that therapeutic supervisor will intervene. During that therapeutic visitation, the child is always supported on what he or she wishes to say regarding the referring problem and other matters. And again, it's not about the parent acknowledging the guilt, but being asked to listen. So the session is not there to be used to determine the truth. And this is really explained ahead of time to both the child and the parent. And when I talk about the intake process, you'll see a little bit more about that. But really, it's for that child to have a space to share their perspective on how they felt and what went on for them. And for the parent, again, doesn't have to acknowledge guilt, but has to listen and be supportive of the child, and may take responsibility for some of their behaviors and actions, but not having to say, I'm guilty, but being able to acknowledge their role in that and to understand their child's perspective. Again, really, it's to support the child and to provide an understanding of the relationship between the child and the non-residential parent. And so, again, in this therapeutic visitation, we can talk about the court's requirement for the supervision and how come we're having to do a supervised visitation and how come that child is not allowed just to go over to that parent's house at any time or spend the night. I think this really mirrors the work in TFCBT to give support to the child as well as to allow the parent to understand the child's perspective and be supportive of that child. All right, any questions on the supervised visitation, whether supportive or therapeutic? I'm going to talk a little briefly about our other service, which is monitored custodial exchanges. Excuse me. Give me a chance to drink some water, too. All right. So when we talk about a monitored custodial exchange, it may be that the parents are both residential parents in the sense of they may have a joint custody parenting plan. They may spend, or it may be what you might consider a traditional visitation or parenting plan where it's every other weekend and one night a week, or it could be week-to-week custody exchanges. A lot of times what we see is that parents find it difficult to coordinate the exchange, and during that exchange there's increased conflict and tension between the parents or family members when that exchange is occurring. A lot of times what we've seen is that custody exchanges often occur at the child's school or the police station or a parking lot of like Walmart or Target or a gas station. And so I'd like you all to kind of think a little bit about the child's perspective of what it's like to have to meet at a police station for their parents to exchange them from one home to the other, and how threatening and dangerous that might seem to a child, or how threatening and dangerous it might seem to a child not to know what's going to happen when they go from one parent's car to the next and not too sure what's going to happen with their parents. Even though some families rely on friends or relatives, again, that might not be the most comfortable situation for the child, and the child continues to be placed in these tense and conflictual situations. And possibility of being exposed to more traumatic events or conflict, especially when we look at domestic violence situations. And so a lot of times I've worked with children who that their parents have gotten into a conflict or a fight or argument during that exchange, and they have felt really threatened and not knowing what to do and feeling scared to go from one car to the next. And even though it may be occurring in a police station doesn't mean it's going to be safe or healthy for the child. A lot of times it is just an outpost station, and the only thing the police are there is they may have cameras on their parking lot, but they may not. And they may not want to get involved unless there is a call or a 911 call. And so, again, even at a police station, it's not always a safe place for that exchange to take place. And so, again, a monitored exchange provides a neutral setting where the first concern is the child, We have staff with specialized training that supervises or monitors the exchange. In a couple of slides, you'll see how that exchange looks. And we also provide a neutral and factual documentation of each scheduled exchange. So much like the supportive supervised visitation, it's really just a factual documentation of when someone arrived, when they left, that sort of thing, and if any critical incidents occurred. I forgot to mention this in the therapeutic supervised visitation. There's also factual documentation of those, but it's much like a progress note as you would in a family therapy session, so that you may have more information in that documentation versus a supportive or a monitored exchange. So let's talk a little bit about then what a monitored custodial exchange looks like at our center. So the parent with the child in their current custody would drop off the child 15 minutes before the exchange takes place. The parent will sign in a logbook. Again, that serves as a legal document to show when they arrived and who brought them. And then the child for the 15 minutes waits for their other parent, and this really provides that time for the child to transition. I don't know how many of you have worked with children that go into different homes on either a week-to-week basis or an every other weekend. There's often a lot of difficulties during that transition into one parent's home from the next, and hopefully providing a space for the child to have that transition at our center gives them that chance to transition in a more beneficial way for them. During the waiting or transition time, the child may watch a child-friendly movie, may work on a puzzle, color, draw, play, but all during that time they're being supervised by our trained personnel and given that time to really engage in some activity between the exchange of custody. Then the parent who's receiving custody would arrive 15 minutes later and would sign in, and then the child or children would leave with the receiving parent. And so there's, again, an opportunity for the child to transition, as well as there not to be time that the parent is in, that the two parents are having to interact. There's no interaction between the two parents, therefore decreases the conflict or tension that the child might be exposed to. So when we talk about what's needed from the court as a referral surface, when they're the referral source, there is a court ordered for supervised visitation, and the court can designate that type, whether it be supportive, therapeutic, or some combination, or that order may state the agency decides on the appropriate type of visitation. And that might be from recommendations from the current therapist or providing service provider that the court may have some information from, or from the attorney ad litem if the child has an attorney ad litem. The order also should include the reasons for the supervision, a requirement that the parties sign releases for all involved professionals. So therefore, we're having input on whatever professionals might be involved in this case, as well as being able to give feedback to those agencies or providing professionals. Of course, designating who's responsible for what, as far as is the payment going to be split for the services, or is the non-residential or residential parent responsible for paying for the service? And then any kind of reporting responsibilities, such as upcoming trial dates or hearings, that they need the information on the documentation of the services. Now, a referring agency, such as any of the agencies that you all work for, or if you're in a private practice, you can make a direct referral. But the referral can include the reason that you think that supervised visitation is needed or helpful for this family. Again, a signed release for all the involved professionals. And then really what is needed for the referring agency to maintain contact with the parties. So if you're involved in working with the parties, it's just really helpful to understand what you need that's going to be helpful to continue to provide the services that you provide. Now, as we go through an intake with the family, we really have to have any relevant court orders regarding custody and visitation, including protective orders. So if there are protective orders, we need to be clear what they are so that we can help to make sure that we're not going against any of those protective orders. So therefore, if you have a family that may be domestic violence issues, and therefore one parent is not allowed to be in contact with the other parent, but the children can be in contact with both parents, then that might be a reason to do a monitored custodial exchange or a supportive supervised visit so that the parties, the two parents, are not having to interact with each other and go against a protective order. The other information needed for an intake process is if there have been any psychological evaluations of the parents and or children, it's helpful to understand what's going on so that we're aware of what we need to be on the lookout for during these visitations. If there's been any prior visitation reports from any other agencies, that would be helpful. And then also, again, we've already talked about the releases of the information so that therapists treating the involved parties, as well as child's attorney or attorney ad litem, if there's a custody evaluator or psychological evaluator, again, to make sure that they have the information they need about what's how they're doing in that visitation as well, or a monitored custodial exchange. Now, just to be clear, any collateral information that we receive remains confidential and is not released outside of Dore Psychological Services, just like if you receive information from us, you wouldn't release it to a third party without our permission to. And so we're very clear about that too with the parties, that even if we get records, we're not re-releasing them even back to them because we don't know if they have that authority to receive that information. Then for our clients, we obtain a written contract from both a residential and non-residential parent, really explaining what the exact nature of the supervision is, where and when that supervision is going to take place, because we have hours, of course, on Wednesday and Friday evenings, Saturdays and Sundays, to make it easy for that parent to engage in that visit with a child. We also are going to be asking, especially the residential parent, are there topics of conversation that are off limits? Again, given that whatever the court order might state, and making sure that both parents understand what conversations may be off limit, especially if it's a supportive supervised visitation. We're discussing the rules and limitations of our program, conditions for cancellation or termination of the visitation, if we're having to write a report, fees, consent. So just like in any therapeutic services that are provided by any service provider, we are getting informed consent from the parties and making sure they understand what the rules are to participate in the program. There are, if anyone's interested in getting a copy of what kind of the rules, the information packet or intake packet for supervised visitation, I'm going to be happy to email you our form so that you understand. Oh, I think you can email Chad, and Chad will disseminate that information. But I think it's real important for everyone to see how much goes into making sure that the child is safe, as well as that the parents have really strict rules about what they're able to do within our facility. And just to give you an idea, we have, I think maybe it's on this. It's coming up. Yeah, I'm sorry. So some of the safety and security issues, because really we want to ensure that our main goal is to ensure the safety of the child. And then secondary, the residential parent, as well as the clinician and DPS staff. So, but we also are aware of that sometimes the safety may be directed more with a non-residential parent. It may be that the non-residential parent is a victim of domestic violence and was unable to obtain custody of their child, and so we may rearrange some of the services and safety issues we have to make sure the non-residential parent is safe too. we really maintain procedures that promote the safety as well as de-escalation, such as the staggered pickup and drop-off of the children. And so we talked about kind of the staggered pickup and drop-off during a monitored custodial exchange. In a supervised visitation session, what happens is that the non-residential parent arrives first, and they are then taken into a separate waiting area, or they're meeting with their family support specialist if they have gifts or food that they brought that has to be checked in. And then we have lockers that the non-residential parent has to empty their pockets. They're not allowed to bring phones, cameras, anything like that into the supervised visitation session. And so that they arrive 15 minutes early to go through that procedure, and then they're taken to a secure location in a separate waiting area. Then the residential parent arrives with the child or children, checks in, and then leaves the premises. Then the children are taken to the visitation session with their non-residential parent, and then the same procedure at the end. So that the residential parent arrives, picks up the children and leaves, and then 15 minutes later the non-residential parent is allowed to leave. And with that staggering, it's to help so there's not any, it decreases the likelihood of stalking behaviors to occur, as well as for both parents to feel safe and the child to feel safe that their parents aren't going to be engaging in any interactions while they're here. Again, like I said, if the non-residential parent happens to be the victim, then we may switch that around so that therefore the non-residential parent may leave first so that the residential parent can't engage in those stalking behaviors if that's the concern. And so we really, during the intake, are asking all of these questions to see what kind of safety procedures we need to, beyond what we already have in place, if we need to switch, how do we stagger that, or if we need to switch some of those safety issues. I already stated that we have separate waiting areas for residential and non-residential parent. We have written protocols for emergencies and a written security procedures given to and signed by all parties prior to any type of commencement of the supervision or exchanges. And let's say that there is maybe an order that the non-residential parent and maybe other children are allowed into that visitation, or maybe grandparents or aunts or uncles. Anyone that comes to that visitation has to go through these procedures and has to consent to the rules and limits of our sessions. We do have a critical incident form, and again, I could share that with anyone that would like that information. Again, these would be critical incidents that occur during the visitation that we may have to end or suspend that visit, and therefore we have to give documentation to the court of the reason for that suspension of the visitation and or termination of the visitation. So we do conduct a separate interview with mainly the residential parent and non-residential parent. The child comes for like a orientation to our center. They're not being interviewed. It's more just an orientation so that they see where the visits are going to take place, what activities we have for them, what the rules are, so they clearly see that there's separate waiting areas and that sort of thing. Again, with the residential and non-residential parent, we're explaining the rules and procedures, they're signing the agreements, and as I said earlier, the appropriateness of the service remains under constant review. And so at any time during providing therapeutic or supportive supervised visitations or even monitored custodial exchange, if we feel that that isn't being beneficial to the child, or the child is being placed in danger, or it's threatening to the child, then we have the right to terminate that service or suspend that service until whatever behavior is addressed, or if the court is having to address something within the court system. We also are going to introduce the child to whoever is going to be providing services, and sometimes the therapeutic provider or the supportive provider may change, and that really is to help the our support service and our therapeutic clinicians, it decreases that opportunity for collusion to occur with that non-residential parent. So sometimes they will have a different monitor for a session. With a therapeutic, it's more likely going to be the same person, but unless we feel like there is some concern that's happening within that therapeutic session, then we can pull out that therapeutic provider and pull in someone else. And then, let's see, I think really for that child, it's about how we can empower them so that they know that this is a safe and healthy place for them. I've already talked about the referring party and some of the information that we give to usually the court. Again, just date of service. If it is a therapeutic visitation, we'll do a behavioral summary, much like a progress note. Incidents of concern, and that would be for any of the services we provide, especially if we've had to terminate or suspend the visitation. If we feel there needs to be a referral or a cessation of the visit, then we'll send that recommendation to the referring party. And then again, any factual documentation of the custodial exchanges. And this is really where the neutrality and the factual documentation comes into place, because we're not here to offer opinions to the court about when visitation should not be supervised anymore. All we're giving is information about it. All right, I have a question from Dr. Pat. What is the typical rate range for these services in Arkansas? Okay, I'm going to start with that one first. So for our agency, for a supportive supervised visitation, it's $50 an hour. For a therapeutic supervised visitation, it's $100 an hour. For the intake procedure, since it is the intake is done with a licensed clinician, that is at a rate of $100 an hour for the intake, and usually that intake is about an hour and a half for each parent. For the monitored custodial exchanges, the rate is each party pays $15 for each exchange. So if they're coming Friday and then they come back on Sunday, that would be 2 separate exchanges. If it's a Wednesday and they come Wednesday in the early afternoon and they come back, that would just be considered 1 exchange. I think that answered all the questions. That offered the rate question. And that's just what our agency, every agency is different. The only other agencies I'm aware of in Arkansas that provide these services there is an agency in Fort Smith and Texarkana, and I think both of them are not-for-profit agencies, and they have grants to offer some of those services, but they may not offer the therapeutic supervised visitation. The second question was, what is the negative side that therapists need to be made aware of? So the negative, I guess I maybe need more clarification on your question. Negative side, that therapist, if they're working with a child, what they would need to know about what's happening in the supportive or therapeutic supervised visitation. And certainly I can understand that if there is a concern that is brought up by the child in that visitation that we feel that the therapist that's working with a child definitely needs to know about, we will be sharing that information. If there's something else to that question, if you could please just type in additional information. All right. Good questions. Thank you. When we talk about children, of course, there are special considerations, and hopefully you've seen throughout this presentation the importance of making sure that child is safe and making sure this is beneficial to the child. And so certainly we are aware of the impact of court involvement on the child and how that influences their treatment and their goals for the therapeutic or supportive supervised visitation. We do want each parent's perspective in the visitation process to hopefully help bolster that parent-child relationship, and each parent's perspective in the court-involved visitation, because if you don't involve both parents and don't understand what's going on, then you're not aware of maybe the subtleties that are occurring are not occurring in that visitation session. And really the role of our family support specialists, which is what FSS stands for, is really to promote those positive interactions and functioning of the client and the family, and really not to serve as an advocate or a forensic expert or to produce a particular outcome in the legal process. It's really to benefit that parent-child relationship. And so therefore boundaries are important. We've talked about the different kinds of safety and security boundaries, but also boundaries within that session, and I've talked a little bit about collusion and how we help with that. And then it is informed consent. We do discuss the limits of any treatment as well as the limits that you may be providing, as well as not providing an opinion of the parent's custodial suitability. And the last couple of pages are just some references. We are a member of the Supervised Visitation Network, and if you have any questions about other providers in the area, you can go to that website, and they have a listing of the different service providers. AFFC is the Association for, Family, I should say AFCC, sorry, Association of Family and Conciliatory Court. And then a couple of books that may be helpful if you're looking at child custody evaluations, if you're looking at parenting plan evaluations, as well as guidelines for some of these practices. Any more questions?
Hey, thank you, Dawn, for a very informative webinar. I'm going to go on to our CU. So if you'd like a CU, here's the information here. The code is Visitation, and just email that to me and make sure you include your first and last name. We will kind of hang out here for a little bit to field any last-minute questions. So thank you for joining us on the Friday, and I hope you can come to our next webinar in April. So we'll be here to field questions, and I can go back, and if folks want a copy of these resources or any materials, just feel free to email me. So hey, Jan, I see you got a hand raised. Do you have a question, Jan, or? Last call for questions. Of course, if anything comes up, you can email me too, and I can forward those on to Dawn. Okay, well, everyone have a great weekend, and I'll leave this webpage up here for a little bit so you can make sure you get my email and the code word. So everyone take care.